Good morning and welcome. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm managing editor of Australia Institute Press, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Australia's biggest book club for July with our very special guest, Jane Rawson. I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. It's a pretty grey, cold day outside, but I have been seeing that the wattle is just starting to bud. So the land is getting ready to blossom in the near future. My thanks to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who have been custodians and carers for this place for many, many millennia and continue to do so. So just a couple of notes about our webinars. You can type questions for Jane in the Q&A box. You can do it anytime during the webinar. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And this is a live event and it's being recorded. It will be available after we've finished recording on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So Jane Rawson, our excellent guest for today, is a novelist, notably of History of Dreams and The Wreck, and she's co-author of the nonfiction book, The Handbook, Surviving and Living with Climate Change. She's managing editor of Island magazine, and she's based in southeast Lutruwita, Tasmania. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, Alice. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's get started. I'd like for you to tell us a bit about the genesis for human nature. Tell us about where the idea for the book came from. What were your initial stirrings for this collection of essays?
Sure. I think that the thing that really motivated me to get it together and start writing this book was when I moved here. I'm on Palawa land in the Huon Valley in Lutruwita, Tasmania. I moved here from inner city Melbourne in 2019, and part of the reason I moved was I'd written, as you said, the handbook, Surviving and Living with Climate Change, and that had some, pretty dire prognoses for Australia generally and for the world. And I had come to the conclusion that I wasn't really mentally set up to deal with repeated heat waves in Melbourne, and that if I had to choose a horrible climate change future, I liked one where I might burn to death in a bushfire, but spend the rest of the time having a lovely time. So we moved here to Tasmania, and I started working with an organisation called the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, who protect nature on private land, and I was working as their communications coordinator. And through that process, spending a lot of time working with scientists, thinking about nature, thinking about conserving nature, about protecting nature, about humans' relationship with nature, which was something that I had sort of dabbled in through my whole life. I grew up in an environmentalist family. I've always worked in sort of environmental adjacent jobs. But that really kind of brought it to a head. I started questioning a lot of my ideas that I had about our relationship with nature and what our job is in nature, I guess. And all of that led me to start writing questions and short essays for myself until eventually I was like, maybe I have enough thoughts here for a book, which it turned out I did.
Mm. And talk to us a bit about the essay as a form. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you're a novelist, you have an incredible imagination, you've written about worlds that are sort of parallel to ours, adjacent, not necessarily. There's some weirdness, I hope you won't mind my saying, in
Not
your
at all.
fiction. There's an element of speculative fiction. So your novels are wonderfully imaginative, and also novels. They're a long form experience. They're immersive. A story unwinds over a longer period. What appealed to you about the essay form?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had been, I guess I'd been kind of grappling with these issues, with questions like why do we have such a strange relationship with all the other creatures we live with on Earth? Why do we not really care that much what happens to the rest of them? Why are we so focused on ourselves? And that had been coming out through my fiction, but in fairly oblique ways, deniable ways, I think. A History of Dreams, seems like it is a novel about witches in the 1930s in Adelaide, because that's what it is. But it's also about the struggle to make change in the world, and how to feel when you realize that the things that you are trying to achieve or have spent your life trying to achieve are never going to happen, which was how I felt about climate change action. So I'd been sort of trying to do things that way for, I guess, 10, 12, 15 years. But it's these questions that I had about conservation felt like I needed to address them more directly for my own brain, because there were so many layers to them. They weren't sort of a broad theme. They were very complicated and specific and nuanced. So I had written essays before for things like Meanjin and Griffith Review, and those essays, my friends would complain to me about how I was never in those essays. They were all quite, I trained as a journalist. I've been a sort of professional writer, editor most of my life. So my inclination was always to just marshal facts and try to produce something interesting and entertaining that might change your mind a bit. But with this book, I was like, all right, let's have a go at putting myself in here. And in some ways, that was a way to make my job easier, I think, in writing these essays, that by making them personal and my opinion and reflecting on all the times I'd made stupid decisions and had dumb ideas, it made it much easier to write something that I was going to put out there into the world that also included facts. It's like, here you go, I'm probably wrong. What do you reckon? Rather than trying to write something that was like, I figured this out and here is the answer, which I would never have the nerve to do, I think. So yeah, that's kind of how I came to this. And I did try to have themes that weave through all these essays. In some ways, it's a collection of essays. In other ways, it is a book. They do all go together. They could stand alone, but they kind of need each other a bit.
Yeah, the sum of the parts is definitely greater than the individual pieces. Can you tell us a bit about the you mentioned moving to Tasmania, and from the book we learned that one of the prompts for that was sound. And this is one of the essays where I imagine your friends would be very pleased, because as a reader, it feels as though we get to know you a bit. We learn about your experiences. And I think lots of people will have experienced similar things of just what it's like living in a city with the noise and what effect that has on your body and your mind.
Yeah, so this was the second essay that I wrote before I even knew that I had a contract for the book, and was kind of what the first essay I wrote was about nostalgia and how it affects our ideas of nature, and it's reasonably conventional. And then my agent was like, okay, write one more and then we can pitch it to people. So I thought I would, self-sabotage and write this super weird essay that is about my relationship with sound, which is quite disordered. So yeah, one of the reasons that I felt like I had to leave Melbourne was that I became incredibly sensitive to the noise of human voices, and developed a kind of panic response to hearing people talk during times that I perceived as quiet times, which, unreasonably I thought was like after 11 p.m. So living as we did in a very very built up part of Melbourne, with loads of neighbours, most of whom are a lot younger than us, and who worked hospitality jobs and would come home at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and then have what at their age I too would not have called a party, but merely a gathering of friends in which you drink a bunch of wine in the backyard and listen to music on a Tuesday night. I became so perpetually nervous about that happening, and me then having a panic attack about it, that my whole life was sort of bracing myself for these experiences of noise, of human voices. And yeah, so moving somewhere like where we live now, where for the most part I hear a lot of chainsaws and shotguns and motorbikes, but very rarely hear other people talking, is perfect. Also hear loads of birds and possums making horrible noises last night, so loud, but doesn't give me that same horrible reaction. Um, so yeah, so I wanted to write an essay that was about that, that was also about my dad, who now has Alzheimer's and who has always been partially deaf and himself had a very weird relationship with sound that escalated into something much stranger once he had Alzheimer's. And combining that with some ideas about how important sound is to so many animals in their understanding of the world, and that we think about conserving nature and we think about how things look usually, and we're very unaware of how they sound and how much human noises affect other creatures around us.
Mm. And I think that gives us a good way to talk about the title and sort of the underlying premise of the book. Uh, it's got a slash between human and nature on the cover. So, humans and nature, an easy question for you. Are humans part of nature, separate from, related to, adjacent? What's the dynamic happening there?
By the time I'd finished that book, I was like, everything is nature, and also nothing is nature. Um, so the answer is yes, also no. Um, it it felt like I think the point that I got to was when you start talking about nature, talking about protecting nature, talking about whether humans are part of nature, that it does nobody any good to just throw that word nature out there. That you need to stop and think about what is it? What is this idea I have of nature? I need to define my terms. I don't know if this is just my high school debater coming out like it always does. It's just like what are the terms of my argument? What am I calling nature? And then I can do a better job of answering for you the question of what's in and what's out, what matters, what doesn't matter. Because it does seem like in many cases we come in with this unquestioned idea of what nature is. And if we are conservationists or nature lovers, it's just the stuff we like that I want to call nature and therefore protect. If you don't like it, maybe it's the stuff that's in the way of doing the thing that I want to do. So yes, it varies so much that it's hard to say. Can I tell you a thing about the title though?
Yes.
When I so that was my working title, and the publisher really liked it, so he kept it. And my husband was like, "You can't call it that. There's already a band with that name." And I was like, "That band broke up ages ago. That's not going to be a problem." He was like, "People will be Googling and they'll just get the band." I was like, "No, they won't. The band is gone." Anyway, the band reformed about a month before the book came out and went on tour. So we've been tracking each other around the country, but they've never come to any of my shows.
Have you been to any of
I
theirs?
haven't I haven't been to any of their shows either.
Yes. Well, the good news is that you can't copyright a title or a
Yeah,
name. You
yeah.
can you could trademark it, but as far as I know, they haven't trademarked theirs, so that's fine.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay. When you're talking about, the kinds of things you rule in and what you rule out, and then it determines what behavior you have towards it, I feel as though um, pademelons and cats give us a couple of good examples of ways to talk about this. So, and you mentioned your the kind of soundtrack of Tasmania and hearing shots being fired. So, uh, what are those people shooting, I suppose, is question
Yeah.
one. And
Yep.
what does that mean about those animals and their relationship to nature?
So in fact, this year's shooting round was just a few weeks ago. So the area where we live, part of it is bush, but most of it is smallholder farms. And some of them are farms that have been in families for multiple generations. There are a lot of small wallabies around here, both Bennett's wallabies, which have a different name where you're from, I can't remember, and redneck paddy melons, which are a really little wallaby, adorable. They both eat crops, and farmers don't like them. But there seems to be a general disinclination to fence farms here. I guess fencing is super expensive. Most people aren't very rich. And so usually the farmer who owns a lot of the properties around here will about once a year send us a message and say, hey, we're going to be shooting this weekend, Sunday, watch out on the road. should be doing it from like 8 till 2, have a gang of 6 of us. So they essentially just go walk around with some hired shooters all around here and shoot as many paddy melons as they can, pile them up in the ute. I think they use them for dog food at the end of that for their hunting dogs who you hear all morning. So this is an animal that to me is like adorable, incredible. What a miracle to live in a place where these little creatures with their tiny, tiny babies are just hanging out in my garden out here. To my neighbors, obviously they're a pest. They get into their crops and they ruin them, so they shoot them. Um, they're perfectly entitled to do that. You just need to get a protection permit, which is pretty easy, and then you can shoot as many as you want. And you can also get those for wombats and for black swans, for essentially anything that's not endangered. I think you can get a permit to shoot it if you feel like it's impinging on your ability to make a living. Um, so yeah, and it is, the paddy melon is a common species. It's not threatened. Um, so there is a question from, perspective of nature conservation. It would be quite reasonable to say, well, that's fine. Sure, they shot 100 paddy melons this weekend, but there's heaps more paddy melons, so that doesn't matter at all. Obviously, from the farmer's perspective, it's totally fine. From, I mean, I haven't done a survey, but I think most Tasmanians would regard that as normal, okay behavior. It's fine. So many of them get killed on the roads as well. Their little dead bodies are everywhere. But yeah, thinking about them as individuals makes all of those deaths kind of awful. I like the ones that live in my garden, and whenever that weekend comes, I kind of want to put up, I don't know how to speak paddy melon, to put up a sign that's like sanctuary in here. Come and hide, come and hide. Yeah. So yes, yeah, from a conservation perspective, it is kind of not a big deal that those animals are being killed. But yeah, I feel like there are still questions.
I was hosting a visiting publisher from China once and driving them from Sydney to Canberra. And she remarked on these things on the side of the road. What's that? And I said, oh, that's a kangaroo, that's a wombat. And she was horrified that her first experience of Australian animals was with roadkill. It feels
Yeah,
we're pretty accustomed to it here.
yeah.
Um,
Although when mainlanders, as we say here, come to visit Tasmania, they're often refreshingly shocked about the amount of dead animals there are on the road here, because there are so many. There's so
mm.
many because there are so many animals. So yeah. Anyway.
But an animal that you're less likely to see as roadkill is a feral cat, say,
It
and
is true. You do see them occasionally, but yeah, much more rarely. Yeah.
less likely. I know you're a cat lover, and in the book you talk a bit about your relationship with cats and how we think about them. So tell us about cats and your relationship with them.
Sure. I am a cat lover, and I went into this recognizing that I have this bias, and it makes me defensive about all sorts of things in conservation. Because Australian conservation is so opposed to cats. It's sort of a mainstay of how conservation works in Australia, that cats are a primary cause of the death of native animals, and that to a greater or lesser extent they need to either cease to exist or be restricted in some way. So I mean, yeah, I am not such a conservationist weirdo that I have cats that wander out in the garden or anything. My cats are locked up inside. Poor cats. They very rarely interact with nature. But I was interested during the course of trying to justify my love of cats while writing this book to have a think about what the actual impact of cats is on many of the species we have concern for. For example, every year, often more than once a year, there will be a fresh listing of species, whether they have become more or less endangered. And last time that list came out, I went through it and spent a very boring half a day looking at all the creatures who had become more endangered and looking at the things that endangered them. And in no cases was that cats. But at the same time, the government put out a press release that said, we're staging a war on cats. This is our response to endangerment of species. This is our response to the extinction threat. And it felt to me that, well, obviously the government doesn't like to grapple with many of the things that were threatening those species. Climate change, primary one, changes in habitat because we're clearing habitat to expand our agricultural production, expand the places that humans live, and a few other endangered species, a few other invasive species that weren't cats that are a threat, but that are on islands to the north and the west of Australia. So yeah, cats seem to have become a handy shorthand for something that makes it look like governments are doing something when they absolutely refuse to grapple with any of the things that they should be doing, like, not opening new coal mines, closing down the ones we have.
Yeah, that makes me think of it was a fossil fuel company who came up with the term carbon footprint, and
Yeah.
this idea of an individual's responsibility for climate change rather than focusing on the structural issues. That sounds like a kind of equivalent there.
Yeah, definitely. And that's sort of another thing I was interested to think about during this book was this idea of those of us who care about environmental issues, how we are constantly trying to sort of winnow ourselves down to reduce that footprint idea that we have, that so little of the way that we talk about being in the world is expansive, is about making the world better, is about making more of an impact on it, increasing our impact in positive ways, where we've really taken this idea that, as you say, was developed by fossil fuel companies, that the best thing we can do for the world is to be less, to exist less. And yeah, I kind of wanted to write against that notion, and of course against the notion that this is that this crisis that we see around us can in any way be dealt with by me changing my shopping habits slightly. It's just so absurd when governments are so protective of fossil fuel interests in this country, when nothing we could do is even a tiny fraction of that.
Mm. Um, the other question, there are lots of thought experiments in the book, and that's why reading this book feels like having an intelligent conversation with a friend. It feels as though you're kind of playing out an idea. What happens if we follow this path? What happens if we follow that path? One of the paths that you follow is thinking about uh, people's emissions on a massive scale, not so much individuals like you and me. But you mentioned that Taylor Swift's emissions are 424 times the average American, and Americans are already much higher than the average Earth dweller. And then following on from that, you ask us to think about emissions from a mining magnate. And if that person donates to the arts, well, is that okay? I mean, we've just had the recent example of the Bezos wedding in Venice and the spectacular amount of emissions that were generated out of that. What do you think of this kind of equation, Taylor Swift spreading joy around the world? Does that make it okay?
I kind of, as I was saying before, I was interested in this idea that all we do is think about the negatives of our lives, and I was particularly interested in the fact that everyone had, at the time I was writing this, been going off about Taylor Swift's emissions, and I was like, well, this seems partly to be like, let's get on the back of some young woman who's trying to do her job, and I was interested in contrasting that with this, Russian mining magnate who doesn't get pulled up, for his massive emissions, many times larger personal emissions than someone like Taylor Swift. And I was, thinking about how much joy someone like her brings to people. It seemed like if you're gonna, and we do these carbon equations with sort of no notion of what is it being spent on, what is the good that comes out of it. Is it okay, or is it more okay if so much joy comes from this thing? there's no way to quantify that. There's no way to work it out. Like you said, it's a thought experiment. It was just that I wanted to slightly mess with the idea that all of these emissions are equivalent, whatever they're done in the name of. Um, are there times where we can think about, well, I'm doing this thing, but I feel like it's adding something of great value to the world. So perhaps this is worth pursuing.
Mm. And I suppose that feeds into the question of human exceptionalism. I mean, what do you think of the idea of separating humans from animals? Where do those kinds of arguments take us?
It did feel like the main, and I don't know if you're going to want to talk about this more later, but it felt like so there were so many things where it seemed like that divide was it just doesn't really work in life. I mean, we've spent a lot of time trying to prove that we're smarter or that we're better at planning for the future or we're better at using tools or we're better at recognizing other people's or creatures' emotions. And the more research that science has done on these things, all of those things tend to be disproved in one way or another. Particularly as we always seem to set humans up as like this is the model. How are other things going at achieving this model that we've set up? Intelligence, for example, we're like, well, this form of intelligence is the ideal. Everybody else seems to be failing at doing it, but we don't often look at, well, other animals are very good at this thing. How does everybody else go at this? What if we hold this up as the ideal? Jumping, for example.
Mm.
We're terrible at jumping, very bad at it. Um, I guess everything, including us, is incredibly well adapted for the life that it lives, or it wouldn't still exist. And we all have the skills and attributes that we have evolved to deal with that particular set of circumstances, whatever those might be. But there is one thing that does tend to separate us, which is that nearly everything else, when it dies, falls over where it is and turns into fuel for the next bunch of things that come along, is eaten by them. Things grow out of it. We get our meat and try to keep it away from everything else. And that is a thing that really only humans seem to do. Put ourselves in a box or burn ourselves, whatever it is we don't want it put back into the system to continue life.
I mean, when you say keep it away, you actually talk in the book about how much pollution is associated with dealing with human remains, and that was one of the parts of the book I I found really fascinating. Actually, the idea of it's not just that we're keeping it away, but we're creating something that's worse for the planet.
Yeah, the the part that I researched and wrote about cremation, I went back and rechecked it and double checked facts and looked in other places because it made me really uncomfortable how I knew like how polluting cremation was from an emissions perspective, like massive amounts of energy because you've got to be burnt at such a high temperature. But the fact that starting to think about what does this mean for what resources are left from us for other creatures to use, the fact that you just turned it all into vapor and what's left is kind of toxic. Um, like several of the gardening websites I looked at were like, do not put that on plants. It's very, very bad for plants. And I knew that so many people I knew had lovingly put their parents, their families' remains somewhere nice in the garden to grow something. So was like, I don't want to believe that's true, but yeah, I mean, there are so many national parks who are like, please do not put cremated remains in the national park. It is very bad for everything. Um, and the fact that we our governments have been very resistant to letting us introduce other means of dealing with human remains beyond burial and cremation, although technologically many other systems exist. Plus, there's also the option of like just falling down on the ground like other things do and seeing what happens. But yes, I don't think we're quite ready for that.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Um, We're going to move to questions from the audience in a little bit, so please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. Um, you mentioned the research that you did for the cremation material, but this is in some ways, there's an element of the sort of bowerbird to this book. It feels as though you found these beautiful, striking ideas and images and pieces of information, and then brought them together in this very welcoming nest that the reader can come and sit in. Can you talk a bit about your research process and how you drew together these disparate elements?
Yeah, there was, so I wrote the bulk of this book over about 6 months. And the process usually involved, I have an idea. How can I go read things about this? So it would be searching through scientific papers to some extent, but a lot of reading books. And those books would then have another idea in it that would lead me off onto a different idea. And then I'd have to read about that for 2 days. And then there'd be a lot of sitting there with my notes, thinking through whether I had sufficiently proved that idea and what was sort of the alternative to it, and challenging both of those constantly against each other, to make sure that I had really thought it through. I was really keen to make sure I'd really thought through all these things, and often that would then lead to me using people I had worked with previously, annoying them with really stupid questions like, is there a way to stop wrens from fighting one another? Um, you know, the kinds of questions you can't Google. Can you stop wrens fighting one another? Luckily, I knew someone who'd done a PhD on wrens, so we had a great chat. So yeah, it was really kind of just letting an idea go where it would, not stopping it, continuing to ask questions, continuing to challenge it. Which means it's a book that doesn't really present any answers about anything, which may be exasperating and no fun for some readers. But I am someone who doesn't really enjoy reading books that say, I've figured this out, here's the answer, because I always tend to disagree and say, yeah, but did you think about? I want to see all the working out behind that answer. So that was what I wanted to do. And I also don't enjoy reading books that have a kind of lecturing tone or a tone of, I am very sad about this. Why aren't you more sad about this? If you knew how bad this was, you would be more sad. I'm like, yeah, I know, but thanks. So I didn't want to take that tone either. So
Mm.
this is this book.
Yeah, it's something that we're interested in at the Australia Institute is how to take the information that we have and find ways to share it with as many people as possible and see what happens when they have access to that information. I mean, you say that it's not a book that offers it's definitely not didactic and it doesn't have a clear argument, but are you are you keen for readers to question their sort of unexamined assumptions? Are you trying to drive curiosity, or is that kind of stuff not in your head when you're writing?
Yeah, I think it is that I'm keen to drive curiosity, that I'm keen to put myself in a position where I frequently look dumb, to say that these questions that you have are not stupid. These questions about why do we call this an introduced species, but we don't call this an introduced species? Those are not stupid questions. There are so many assumptions about how totally unquestioned assumptions about how we talk about nature. And it's completely fine to ask questions that you think are dumb, because they might lead to some really interesting ideas. And they might also help the people who you're asking those questions of to have a think through some things, or to be okay themselves to say, you know what, I've often wondered about that, and this is great to discuss. Yeah, I mean, I studied journalism because I firmly believe that I could change the world with information, that once people knew the facts about things, they would behave differently. And I think the last 20 years or whatever it's been of working in climate change and environmental communication has clearly shown that that is not the case, that that we know that most Australians, for example, want action on climate change, that they have enough information to know that, and that the barrier is not lack of information, that the barrier is, and Australia Institute is doing excellent work on this, that the barrier is vested interests that are blocking any kind of action. So yeah, yeah.
Yes. And we will continue with that work. There's a little bit of conversation in the chat about feral cats and the effect that they have. I don't think that you're not saying that they have no impact
No,
on
no, no,
on
no,
wildlife. It's
no, not at all. Yeah, no. Feral cats are incredibly destructive, particularly on islands, um, and there is potential to make a difference by removing feral cats. By removing, I mean killing. That's what I'm saying. By killing feral cats on islands, places like Bruny Island, where there is a really effective and community-led, to an extent, community-led science. Um, oh, I've forgotten the word. It's backed by science. A lot of scientists are involved in it, and the whole community is on board with trying to remove cats from the landscape in Bruny. So yeah, that those sorts of things can make a real difference. But I think, I mean, there are the threats that are caused to already endangered species, the forces that will push vulnerable species into endangerment are as much about things like climate change, are as much about habitat destruction. Habitat destruction creates a situation where animals like cats can have their pick of the native species that are left. We create these situations through the way that we live that make a landscape where little creatures are a buffet for cats. Where if we had not done that, if we had not stripped these landscapes for sheep farming, for cow farming, for homes, the cats wouldn't be able to wreak the kind of destruction that they do. So yeah, I think that we need to be more serious about addressing those other issues and not just fixating on a few things that seem like easy fixes but don't really change that much.
yeah. The book has been out for, is it a couple of months at this
Came
point?
out in April, beginning of
Yeah.
April. Yeah.
Have you, how has it been talking about it and having these conversations? Have you had much in the way of feedback or pushback? What have the responses been like?
It's been so scary. Even doing this is terrifying. I'm actually trying not to look at the chat because like I will, because I will constantly be like, "You're right, I'm stupid. I'm sorry, I'm here." um,
We are
like,
delighted to have you.
yeah. um, there was, so I when I spoke in Sydney, there was a chap in the audience who put his hand up and said, "Your ideas are stupid,
Okay.
and I'm here to tell you why." And I did have a similar experience in Launceston. That fellow was a little less upfront about how stupid he thought I was, but did go on to tell me in some detail about how stupid I was.
Hmm.
But what I have found encouraging is that a lot of conservation scientists who I know who have read the book have been like, this was great. This got me to think about a whole bunch of things, or to acknowledge that I had doubts about things that I hadn't felt comfortable doubting. And for me, that is kind of the most rewarding response, because much as I sort of would love to have something that speaks to a general audience, I know that the people I'm really talking to are all the conservation ecologists I've worked with for years and years, and hoping that it's useful to them. And then, sort of, in the next level out, to anyone who works in conservation or whose life is devoted to conservation. Because I, yeah, like, don't get me wrong, I love nature, whatever that means. I really love all the different things that live on the planet, and it kills me how little we show care for everything else that's in this world. And and I hope that by having these sort of slightly uncomfortable questions, we can do a better job of that. So yes, yeah.
And as a Tasmanian who's just been through,
I'm not a Tasmanian.
as someone who lives in Tasmania, who
Yeah,
has just been through, I didn't realize I was a mainlander until I
you're a
visited
mainlander.
Tasmania.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
found that out. As someone who lives in Tasmania, who's just been through the recent election, you know that the Australia Institute has been particularly interested in Macquarie Harbour and what's happening with the skate, for example. Can you talk to us a little bit about what things are looking like on the ground there? What kinds of conversations are happening that you've seen?
That election, this place. Um, neither the ALP nor the Liberal Party in Tasmania discussed environmental issues during the lead up to this election.
Mm,
Both of them are very pro big business salmon farming. Both of them are very pro big business. They're both very pro logging. They're both very pro stronger laws against any sort of protest. Particularly the ALP, maybe even more so than the Liberals here, very keen to wipe out any sort of protest on environmental matters. So there was not a lot of discussion of environmental issues here. Peter George, who is an independent, um, who is in the Huon Valley, one of his main campaign points was ending salmon farming, and he was elected. He had run previously for the federal election, didn't get up, but got really quite close considering this is a really safe Labor seat in the federal election. So he will be in state parliament now. There is a cohort of independents, plus, of course, the Greens, who are keen to see more done on salmon farming in particular. So I guess we'll see. But, the Labor and Liberal here are essentially the same party. And why they don't just form a coalition, I don't know. Stop pretending they're different people. So if they decide to work together, then there's very little chance of making any change.
mm. We have a question from Phoebe Roundtree who says she's aware that you don't want to be too directive to your readers, but she's interested in what are some of the feelings or messages you hope readers step away with, and what do you hope they mull over?
I think the main things I would like them to do, well, yeah, is to be curious, to question some of their assumptions about what they think nature is, about what they think is worth caring about and what isn't worth caring about. To when you hear someone say something about nature. So, for example, okay, I am not vegan, but in nature conservation circles, you might find people who are like, I don't understand why people are vegan. It's actually worse for the environment. Instead of saying that, have a think about, okay, well, what is it that they are trying to achieve? Let me think through their arguments. Let me listen to them. Where are they coming from? What is what do we have in common? What are we both caring about? Is the core of all this that we actually both really love other animals? And that's great. Let's be open about it. So it's that sort of thing. But it is, I guess the other thing I would hope for people to do is to be more tender and open about their feelings. I think we are it's really tough being in the world at the moment, caring about things, as we all know. Um, and it's really tempting to be cynical and to dismiss other people's ways of having these same feelings, to dismiss other people's ways of coping with all this destruction. So trying to be gentler on other people and on yourself and being like, it's okay that I just want to cry a bunch. Things suck. So yeah, yep.
Yeah. And I think it's also trying to imagine, not to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me as though part of what you're interested in is trying to imagine how a conversation might play out with someone who has that position. And so coming at all of these ideas from different entry points and then seeing what happens if you stress test this idea or stress test that idea, and what comes out of it. This book is such a delightful book to read because it's, for a number of reasons, partly because it's unexpected, partly because I learned lots of things I didn't know already. For example, that orange-bellied parrots are taken on a plane to mimic the migration. You have all sorts, when you were talking about the wrens before and the way that they fight. So this reconceptualization of nature and humans' relations to it, humans as part of nature, humans as separate, it's such a delightful read. A number of people in the chat were saying that they've either read it or read a few chapters and have been enjoying it very much. So I recommend it very, very highly. Thank you so much, Jane, for being part of our Australia's Biggest Book Club today. And thank you for everyone coming along. Don't forget to subscribe to... we've got a raised hand. We just, if you can put your question in the chat and then we can answer it. We don't have the functionality for answering live. Sorry about that. That's just the way that our webinars go. But I think I'll have to wrap it up there. Remember to subscribe to Australia Institute podcasts. We've got After America, Follow the Money, and Dollars and Cents. We hope to see you next month for book club again. And thank you so much, Jane.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.